Chapter 37 of Beasts, Men and Gods. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Beasts, Men and Gods by Ferdinand OSSENDOWSKI. Chapter 37. The Camp of Martyrs. Near the entrance to the town, a motor car stood before a small house.
"What does that mean?" exclaimed the Baron. "Go over there."
Our car drew up beside the other. The house door opened sharply. Several officers rushed out and tried to hide.
"Stand!" commanded the general. "Go back inside."
They obeyed and he entered after them, leaning on his tashur. As the door remained open, I could see and hear everything. "Woe to them," whispered the chauffeur. "Our officers knew that the Baron had gone out of the town with me, which means always a long journey, and must have decided to have a good time. He will order them beaten to death with sticks." I could see the end of the table covered with bottles and tin things. At the side 2 young women were seated, who sprang up at the appearance of the general. I could hear the hoarse voice of Baron Ungern pronouncing sharp, short, stern phrases.
"Your native land is perishing. The shame of it is upon all you Russians. And you cannot understand it, nor feel it. You need wine and women. Scoundrels, brutes! 150 tashur for every man of you."
The voice fell to a whisper.
"And you, mesdames, do you not realize the ruin of your people? No, for you it is of no moment. And have you no feeling for your husbands at the front who may even now be killed? You are not women. I honor woman, who feels more deeply and strongly than man, but you are not women. Listen to me, mesdames. Once more and I will hang you."
He came back to the car and himself sounded the horn several times. Immediately Mongol horsemen galloped up.
"Take these men to the commandant. I will send my orders later."
On the way to the Baron's yurta we were silent. He was excited and breathed heavily, lighting cigarette after cigarette and throwing them aside after but a single puff or two.
"Take a supper with me," he proposed.
He also invited his chief of staff, a very retiring, oppressed but splendidly educated man. The servants spread a Chinese hot course for us, followed by cold meat and fruit compote from California with the inevitable tea. We ate with chopsticks. The Baron was greatly distraught. Very cautiously I began speaking of the offending officers and tried to justify their actions by the extremely trying circumstances under which they were living.
"They are rotten through and through, demoralized, sunk into the depths," murmured the general.
The chief of staff helped me out and at last the Baron directed him to telephone the commandant to release these gentlemen. The following day I spent with my friends, walking a great deal about the streets and watching their busy life. The great energy of the Baron demanded constant nervous activity from himself and everyone round him. He was everywhere, seeing everything, but never interfering with the work of his subordinate administrators. Every one was at work. In the evening I was invited by the Chief of Staff to his quarters, where I met many intelligent officers. I related again the story of my trip and we were all chatting along animatedly when suddenly Colonel Sepailoff entered, singing to himself. All the others at once became silent and one by one, under various pretexts, they slipped out. He handed our host some papers and, turning to us, said, "I shall send you for supper a splendid fish pie and some hot tomato soup." As he left, my host clasped his head in desperation and said, "With such scum of the earth are we now forced after this revolution to work." A few minutes later a soldier from Sepailoff brought us a tureen full of soup and the fish pie. As the soldier bent over the table to set the dishes down, the chief motioned me with his eyes and slipped to me the words, "Notice his face." When the man went out, my host sat attentively listening until the sounds of the man's steps ceased. He is Sepalov's executioner who hangs and strangles the unfortunate condemned ones." Then, to my amazement, he began to pour out the soup on the ground beside the brazier and, going out of the yurta, threw the pie over the fence. "It is Sepalov's feast, and though it may be very tasty, it may also be poison. In Sepalov's house, it is dangerous to eat or drink anything." Distinctly oppressed by these doings, I returned to my house. My host was not yet asleep and met me with a frightened look. My friends were also there. "God be thanked!" they all exclaimed. "Has nothing happened to you?" "What is the matter?" I asked. "You see," began the host, "after your departure a soldier came from Sepelov and took your luggage, saying that you had sent him for it, but we knew what it meant, that they would first search it and afterwards—" I at once understood the danger. Sepelov could place anything he wanted in my luggage and afterwards accuse me. My old friend the agronome and I started at once for Sepelov's, where I left him at the door while I went in and was met by the same soldier who had brought the supper to us. Sepelov received me immediately. In answer to my protest he said that it was a mistake and, asking me to wait for a moment, went out. I waited 5, 10, 15 minutes but nobody came. I knocked on the door but no one answered me. Then I decided to go to Baron Ungern and started for the exit. The door was locked. Then I tried the other door and found that also locked. I had been trapped. I wanted at once to whistle to my friend but just then noticed a telephone on the wall and called up Baron Ungern. In a few minutes he appeared together with Sepelov. "What is this?" he asked Sepelov in a severe, threatening voice, and without waiting for an answer, struck him a blow with his tashur that sent him to the floor. We went out and the general ordered my luggage produced. Then he brought me to his own yurta. "Live here now," he said. "I am very glad of this accident," he remarked with a smile, "for now I can say all that I want to." This drew from me the question, "May I describe all that I have heard and seen here?" He thought a moment before replying, "Give me your notebook." I handed him the album with my sketches of the trip and he wrote therein, "After my death, Baron Ungern." "But I am older than you and I shall die before you," I remarked. He shut his eyes, bowed his head and whispered, "Oh no, 130 days yet and it is finished. Then Nirvana. How wearied I am with sorrow, woe and hate." We were silent for a long time. I felt that I had now a mortal enemy in Colonel Sepelov and that I should get out of Urga at the earliest possible moment. It was 2 o'clock at night. Suddenly Baron Ungern stood up. "Let us go to the great good Buddha," he said with a countenance held in deep thought and with eyes aflame, his whole face contracted by a mournful, bitter smile. He ordered the car brought. Thus lived this camp of martyrs, refugees pursued by events to their tryst with death, driven on by the hate and contempt of this offspring of Teutons and privateers. And he, martyring them, knew neither day nor night of peace. Fired by impelling, poisonous thoughts, he tormented himself with the pains of a Titan, knowing that every day in this shortening chain of 130 links brought him nearer to the precipice called death. End of chapter. Chapter 38 of Beasts, Men and Gods. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Beasts, Men and Gods by Ferdinand OSSENDOWSKI. Chapter 38. Before the Face of Buddha. As we came to the monastery, we left the automobile and dipped into the labyrinth of narrow alleyways until at last we were before the greatest temple of Urga with the Tibetan walls and windows and its pretentious Chinese roof. A single lantern burned at the entrance. The heavy gate with the bronze and iron trimmings was shut. When the general struck the big brass gong hanging by the gate, frightened monks began running up from all directions and, seeing the General Baron, fell to the earth in fear of raising their heads. "Get up," said the Baron, "and let us into the temple." The inside was like that of all Lama temples, the same multicolored flags with the prayers, symbolic signs and the images of holy saints, the big bands of silk cloth hanging from the ceiling, the images of the gods and goddesses. On both sides of the approach to the altar were the low red benches for the Lamas and choir. On the altar small lamps threw their rays on the gold and silver vessels and candlesticks. Behind it hung a heavy yellow silk curtain with Tibetan inscriptions. The Lamas drew the curtain aside. Out of the dim light from the flickering lamps gradually appeared the great gilded statue of Buddha seated in the golden lotus. The face of the god was indifferent and calm, with only a soft gleam of light animating it. On either side he was guarded by many thousands of lesser Buddhas, brought by the faithful as offerings in prayer. The Baron struck the gong to attract great Buddha's attention to his prayer and threw a handful of coins into the large bronze bowl. And then this scion of crusaders, who had read all the philosophers of the West, closed his eyes, placed his hands together before his face and prayed. I noticed a black rosary on his left wrist. He prayed about 10 minutes. Afterwards he led me to the other end of the monastery and, during our passage, said to me: "I do not like this temple. It is new, erected by the Lamas when the living Buddha became blind. I do not find on the face of the golden Buddha either tears, hopes, distress, or thanks of the people. They have not yet had time to leave these traces on the face of the god. We will go now to the old shrine of prophecies." This was a small building, blackened with age and resembling a tower with a plain round roof. The doors stood open. At both sides of the door were prayer wheels ready to be spun. Over it, a slab of copper with the signs of the zodiac. Inside, 2 monks, who were intoning the sacred sutras, did not lift their eyes as we entered. The general approached them and said: "Cast the dice for the number of my days." The priest brought 2 bowls with many dice therein and rolled them out on their low table. The Baron looked and reckoned with them the sum before he spoke. 130! Again 130! Approaching the altar carrying an ancient stone statue of Buddha brought all the way from India, he again prayed. As day dawned, we wandered out through the monastery, visited all the temples and shrines, the museum of the medical school, the astrological tower and then the court where the Bandi and young Lamas have their daily morning wrestling exercises. In other places the Lamas were practicing with the bow and arrow. Some of the higher Lamas feasted us with hot mutton, tea and wild onions. After we returned to the yurta I tried to sleep, but in vain. Too many different questions were troubling me. Where am I? In what epoch am I living? I knew not, but I dimly felt the unseen touch of some great idea, some enormous plan, some indescribable human woe. After our noon meal, the general said he wanted to introduce me to the living Buddha. It is so difficult to secure audience with the living Buddha that I was very glad to have this opportunity offered me. Our auto soon drew up at the gate of the red and white striped wall surrounding the palace of the god. 200 Lamas in yellow and red robes rushed to greet the arriving Changchung general with a low-toned, respectful whisper, "Khan, god of war." As a regiment of formal ushers, they led us to a spacious great hall softened by its semi-darkness. Heavy carved doors opened to the interior parts of the palace. In the depths of the hall stood a dais with the throne covered with yellow silk cushions. The back of the throne was red inside a gold framing. At either side stood yellow silk screens set in highly ornamented frames of black Chinese wood, while against the walls at either side of the throne stood glass cases filled with varied objects from China, Japan, India and Russia. I noticed also among them a pair of exquisite marquises and marquises in the fine porcelain of Sèvres. Before the throne stood a long, low table at which 8 noble Mongols were seated, their chairman, a highly esteemed old man with a clever, energetic face and with large penetrating eyes. His appearance reminded me of the authentic wooden images of the Buddhist holy men with eyes of precious stones which I saw at the Tokyo Imperial Museum in the department devoted to Buddhism, where the Japanese show the ancient statues of Amida, Daionuchi Buddha, the goddess Kwannon, and the jolly old Hotai. This man was the Hutuktu Jahansi, chairman of the Mongolian Council of Ministers, and honored and revered far beyond the bournes of Mongolia. The others were the ministers, Khans and the highest princes of Khalkha. Jahansu Hutuktu invited Baron Ungern to the place at his side, while they brought in a European chair for me. Baron Ungern announced to the Council of Ministers through an interpreter that he would leave Mongolia in a few days and urged them to protect the freedom won for the lands inhabited by the successors of Genghis Khan, whose soul still lives and calls upon the Mongols to become anew a powerful people and reunite again into one great mid-Asiatic state all the Asian kingdoms he had ruled. The general rose and all the others followed him. He took leave of each one separately and sternly. Only before Jahansi Lama he bent low while the Hutuktu placed his hands on the Baron's head and blessed him. From the council chamber we passed at once to the Russian-style house which is the personal dwelling of the living Buddha. The house was wholly surrounded by a crowd of red and yellow lamas, servants, councillors of Bogdo, officials, fortune-tellers, doctors and favorites. From the front entrance stretched a long red rope whose outer end was thrown over the wall beside the gate. Crowds of pilgrims crawling up on their knees touch this end of the rope outside the gate and hand the monk a silken hatyk or a bit of silver. This touching of the rope whose inner end is in the hand of the Bogdo establishes direct communication with the holy, incarnated living God. A current of blessing is supposed to flow through this cable of camel's wool and horsehair. Any Mongol who has touched the mystic rope receives and wears about his neck a red band as the sign of his accomplished pilgrimage. I had heard very much about the Bogdo Khan before this opportunity to see him. I had heard of his love of alcohol, which had brought on blindness, about his leaning toward exterior Western culture and about his wife drinking deep with him and receiving in his name numerous delegations and envoys. In the room which the Bogdo used as his private study, where two Lama secretaries watched day and night over the chest that contained his great seals, there was the severest simplicity. On a low, plain, Chinese lacquered table lay his writing implements, a case of seals given by the Chinese government and by the Dalai Lama and wrapped in a cloth of yellow silk. Nearby was a low easy chair, a bronze brazier with an iron stovepipe leading up from it. On the walls were the signs of the swastika, Tibetan and Mongolian inscriptions. Behind the easy chair, a small altar with a golden statue of Buddha before which two tallow lamps were burning. The floor was covered with a thick yellow carpet. When we entered, only the two Lama secretaries were there, for the living Buddha was in the small private shrine in an adjoining chamber, where no one is allowed to enter save the Bogdo Khan himself and one Lama, Kampo Gelong, who cares for the temple arrangements and assists the living Buddha during his prayers of solitude. The secretary told us that the Bogdo had been greatly excited this morning. At noon he had entered his shrine. For a long time the voice of the head of the Yellow Faith was heard in earnest prayer, and after his another unknown voice came clearly forth. In the shrine had taken place a conversation between the Buddha on earth and the Buddha of heaven. Thus the Lamas phrased it to us. "Let us wait a little," the Baron proposed. "Perhaps he will soon come out." As we waited, the general began telling me about Jahansi Lama, saying that when Jahansi is calm, he is an ordinary man, but when he is disturbed and thinks very deeply, a nimbus appears about his head. After half an hour, the Lama secretaries suddenly showed signs of deep fear and began listening closely by the entrance to the shrine. Shortly they fell on their faces on the ground. The door slowly opened and there entered the Emperor of Mongolia, the living Buddha. His Holiness Bogdu Jejebsung Damba Hutuktu, Khan of Outer Mongolia. He was a stout old man with a heavy shaven face resembling those of the cardinals of Rome. He was dressed in the yellow silken Mongolian coat with a black binding. The eyes of the blind man stood widely open. Fear and amazement were pictured in them. He lowered himself heavily into the easy chair and whispered, "Write." A secretary immediately took paper and a Chinese pen as the Bogdo began to dictate his vision, very complicated and far from clear. He finished with the following words: "This I, Bogdo Hutuktu Khan, saw, speaking with the great wise Buddha, surrounded by the good and evil spirits. Wise lamas, Hutuktus, Kampos, Marambas, and holy Gegans, give the answer to my vision." As he finished, he wiped the perspiration from his head and asked who were present. "Khan Chiang Chin Baron Ungern and a stranger," one of the secretaries answered on his knees. The general presented me to the Bogdo, who bowed his head as a sign of greeting. We began speaking together in low tones. Through the open door I saw a part of the shrine. I made out a big table with a heap of books on it, some open and others lying on the floor below, a brazier with the red charcoal in it, a basket containing the shoulder blades and entrails of sheep for telling fortunes. Soon the Baron rose and bowed before the Bogdo. The Tibetan placed his hands on the Baron's head and whispered a prayer. Then he took from his own neck a heavy icon and hung it around that of the Baron. "You will not die, but you will be incarnated in the highest form of being. Remember that, incarnated god of war, Khan of grateful Mongolia." I understood that the living Buddha blessed the bloody general before death. During the next 2 days I had the opportunity to visit the living Buddha 3 times together with a friend of the Bogdo, the Buryat prince Djam Bolon. I shall describe these visits in Part 4. Baron Ungern organized the trip for me and my party to the shore of the Pacific. We were to go on camels to northern Manchuria because there it was easy to avoid cavilling with the Chinese authorities so badly oriented in the international relationship with Poland. Having sent a letter from Uliassutai to the French legation at Peking and bearing with me a letter from the Chinese Chamber of Commerce expressing thanks for the saving of Uliassutai from a pogrom, I intended to make for the nearest station on the Chinese Eastern Railway and from there proceed to Peking. The Danish merchant E.V. Olofsson was to have traveled out with me and also a learned Lama Turgut, who was headed for China. Never shall I forget the night of May 19th to 20th of 1921. After dinner Baron Ungern proposed that we go to the yurta of Djam Bolon, whose acquaintance I had made on the first day after my arrival in Urga. His yurta was placed on a raised wooden platform in a compound located behind the Russian settlement. 2 Buryat officers met us and took us in. Djam Bolon was a man of middle age, tall and thin with an unusually long face. Before the Great War, he had been a simple shepherd but had fought together with Baron Ungern on the German front and afterwards against the Bolsheviki. He was a Grand Duke of the Buryats, the successor of former Buryat kings who had been dethroned by the Russian government after their attempt to establish the independence of the Buryat people. The servants brought us dishes with nuts, raisins, dates and cheese and served us tea. "This is the last night, Djam Bolon," said Baron Ungern. "You promised me—" "I remember," answered the Buryat. "All is ready." For a long time I listened to their reminiscences about former battles and friends who had been lost. The clock pointed to midnight when Djam Bolon got up and went out of the yurta. "I want to have my fortune told once more," said Baron Ungern, as though he were justifying himself. "For the good of our cause it is too early for me to die." Djam Bolon came back with a little woman of middle years, who squatted down Eastern style before the brazier, bowed low and began to stare at Baron Ungern. Her face was whiter, narrower and thinner than that of a Mongol woman. Her eyes were black and sharp. Her dress resembled that of a gypsy woman. Afterwards I learned that she was a famous fortune teller and prophet among the Buriats, the daughter of a gypsy woman and a Buriat. She drew a small bag very slowly from her girdle, took from it some small bird bones and a handful of dry grass. She began whispering at intervals unintelligible words, as she threw occasional handfuls of the grass into the fire, which gradually filled the tent with a soft fragrance. I felt a distinct palpitation of my heart and a swimming in my head. After the fortune teller had burned all her grass, she placed the bird bones on the charcoal and turned them over again and again with a small pair of bronze pincers. As the bones blackened, she began to examine them, and then suddenly her face took on an expression of fear and pain. She nervously tore off the kerchief which bound her head and, contracted with convulsions, began snapping out short, sharp phrases. I see the god of war. His life runs out horribly. After it a shadow, black like the night. Shadow. 130 steps remain. Beyond darkness, nothing. I see nothing. The god of war has disappeared. Baron Ungern dropped his head. The woman fell over on her back with her arms stretched out. She had fainted, but it seemed to me that I noticed once a bright pupil of one of her eyes showing from under the closed lashes. Two Buriats carried out the lifeless form, after which a long silence reigned in the yurta of the Buriat prince. Baron Ungern finally got up and began to walk around the brazier, whispering to himself. Afterwards he stopped and began speaking rapidly. I shall die! I shall die! But no matter, no matter. The cause has been launched and will not die. I know the roads this cause will travel. The tribes of Genghis Khan's successors are awakened. Nobody shall extinguish the fire in the heart of the Mongols. In Asia there will be a great state from the Pacific and Indian Oceans to the shore of the Volga. The wise religion of Buddha shall run to the north and the west. It will be the victory of the spirit. A conqueror and leader will appear stronger and more stalwart than Genghis Khan and Ugadai. He will be more clever and more merciful than Sultan Baybar, and he will keep power in his hands until the happy day when, from his subterranean capital, shall emerge the king of the world. Why shall I not be in the first ranks of the warriors of Buddhism? Why has karma decided so? But so it must be. And Russia must first wash herself from the insult of revolution, purifying herself with blood and death, and all people accepting communism must perish with their families in order that all their offspring may be rooted out. The Baron raised his hand above his head and shook it, as though he were giving his orders and bequests to some invisible person. Day was dawning. My time has come, said the general. In a little while I shall leave Urga. He quickly and firmly shook hands with us and said, Goodbye for all time. I shall die a horrible death, but the world has never seen such a terror and such a sea of blood as it shall now see. The door of the yurta slammed shut, and he was gone. I never saw him again. I must go also, for I am likewise leaving Urga today. I know it, answered the prince. The Baron has left you with me for some purpose. I will give you a fourth companion, the Mongol Minister of War. You will accompany him to your yurta. It is necessary for you. Djam Bolon pronounced this last with an accent on every word. I did not question him about it, as I was accustomed to the mystery of this country of the mysteries of good and evil spirits. End of chapter. Chapters 39 and 40 of Beasts, Men, and Gods. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Beasts, Men, and Gods by Ferdinand OSSENDOWSKI. Chapter 39. The Man with a Head Like a Saddle. After drinking tea at Djam Bolon's yurta, I rode back to my quarters and packed my few belongings. The Lama Turgut was already there.
"The Minister of War will travel with us," he whispered. "It is necessary."
"All right," I answered, and rode off to Olofsson to summon him. But Olofsson unexpectedly announced that he was forced to spend some few days more in Urga, a fatal decision for him, for a month later he was reported killed by Sepailoff, who remained as commandant of the city after Baron Ungern's departure. The war minister, a stout young Mongol, joined our caravan. When we had gone about 6 miles from the city, we saw an automobile coming up behind us. The Lama shrunk up inside his coat and looked at me with fear. I felt the now familiar atmosphere of danger, and so opened my holster and threw over the safety catch of my revolver. Soon the motor stopped alongside our caravan. In it sat Sepailoff with a smiling face, and beside him his 2 executioners, Chestiakov and Zhdanov. Sepailoff greeted us very warmly and asked, "You are changing your horses at Khazahuduk? Does the road cross that pass ahead? I don't know the way and must overtake an envoy who went there." The Minister of War answered that we would be in Khazahuduk that evening and gave Sepailoff directions as to the road. The motor rushed away and, when it had topped the pass, he ordered one of the Mongols to gallop forward to see whether it had not stopped somewhere near the other side. The Mongol whipped his steed and sped away. We followed slowly. "What is the matter?" I asked. "Please explain." The minister told me that Djam Bolon yesterday received information that Sepailoff planned to overtake me on the way and kill me. Sepailoff suspected that I had stirred up the Baron against him. Djam Bolon reported the matter to the Baron, who organized this column for my safety. The returning Mongol reported that the motor car had gone on out of sight. "Now," said the minister, "we shall take quite another route so that the colonel will wait in vain for us at Khazahuduk." We turned north at Undur Dobo and at night were in the camp of a local prince. Here we took leave of our minister, received splendid fresh horses and quickly continued our trip to the east, leaving behind us the man with a head like a saddle, against whom I had been warned by the old fortune teller in the vicinity of Van Kure. After 12 days without further adventures, we reached the first railway station on the Chinese Eastern Railway, from where I traveled in unbelievable luxury to Peking. Surrounded by the comforts and conveniences of the splendid hotel at Peking, while shedding all the attributes of traveler, hunter and warrior, I could not, however, throw off the spell of those 9 days spent in Urga, where I had daily met Baron Ungern, incarnated god of war. The newspapers carrying accounts of the bloody march of the Baron through Transbaikalia brought the pictures ever fresh to my mind. Even now, although more than 7 months have elapsed, I cannot forget those nights of madness, inspiration and hate. The predictions are fulfilled. Approximately 130 days afterwards, Baron Ungern was captured by the Bolsheviki through the treachery of his officers and, it is reported, was executed at the end of September. Baron R. F. Ungern von Sternberg, like a bloody storm of avenging karma, he spread over Central Asia. What did he leave behind him? The severe order to his soldiers closing with the words of the Revelations of St. John: "Let no one check the revenge against the corrupter and slayer of the soul of the Russian people. Revolution must be eradicated from the world. Against it the Revelations of St. John have warned us thus: and the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations, even the unclean things of her fornication, and upon her forehead a name written: Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of the harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus." It is a human document, a document of Russian and, perhaps, of world tragedy. But there remained another and more important trace. In the Mongol yurtas and at the fires of Buryat, Mongol, Tajungar, Kirghiz, Kalmuk, and Tibetan shepherds still speak the legend born of this son of crusaders and privateers. From the north a white warrior came and called on the Mongols to break their chains of slavery which fell upon our freed soil. This white warrior was the incarnated Genghis Khan, and he predicted the coming of the greatest of all Mongols, who will spread the fair faith of Buddha and the glory and power of the offspring of Genghis, Ugadai, and Kublai Khan. So it shall be. Asia is awakened, and her sons utter bold words. It were well for the peace of the world if they go forth as disciples of the wise creators, Ugadai and Sultan Baber, rather than under the spell of the bad demons of the destructive Tamerlane. End of chapter. Part 4. The Living Buddha. Chapter 40. In the Blissful Garden of 1,000 Joys. In Mongolia, the country of miracles and mysteries, lives the custodian of all the mysterious and unknown, the living Buddha, His Holiness Djebsung Damba Hutuktu Khan, or Bogdo Gekhan, Pontiff of Ta Kure. He is the incarnation of the never-dying Buddha, the representative of the unbroken, mysteriously continued line of spiritual emperors ruling since 1670, concealing in themselves the ever-refining spirit of Buddha Amitabha, joined with Cha Razi, or the compassionate spirit of the mountains. In him is everything, even the sun myth, and the fascination of the mysterious peaks of the Himalayas, tales of the Indian pagoda, the stern majesty of the Mongolian conquerors, emperors of all Asia, and the ancient hazy legends of the Chinese sages. Immersion in the thoughts of the Brahmins, the severities of life of the monks of the virtuous order, the vengeance of the eternally wandering warriors, the Olets, with their Khans, Batur Hun Taigai and Gushi, the proud bequests of Genghis and Kublai Khan, the clerical reactionary psychology of the Lamas, the mystery of Tibetan kings beginning from strong Sang Gampo, and the mercilessness of the yellow sect of Paspa. All the hazy history of Asia, of Mongolia, Pamir, Himalayas, Mesopotamia, Persia and China surrounds the living god of Urga. It is little wonder that his name is honored along the Volga in Siberia, Arabia between the Tigris and Euphrates, in Indochina and on the shores of the Arctic Ocean. During my stay in Urga, I visited the abode of the living Buddha several times, spoke with him and observed his life. His favorite learned Marambas gave me long accounts of him. I saw him reading horoscopes, I heard his predictions, I looked over his archives of ancient books and the manuscripts containing the lives and predictions of all the Bogdo Khans. The Lamas were very frank and open with me, because the letter of the Hutuktu of Narabanchi won for me their confidence. The personality of the living Buddha is double, just as everything in Lamaism is double. Clever, penetrating, energetic, he at the same time indulges in the drunkenness which has brought on blindness. When he became blind, the Lamas were thrown into a state of desperation. Some of them maintained that Bogdo Khan must be poisoned and another incarnate Buddha set in his place, while the others pointed out the great merits of the pontiff in the eyes of Mongolians and the followers of the Yellow Faith. They finally decided to propitiate the gods by building a great temple with a gigantic statue of Buddha. However, this did not help the Bogdo sight, but the whole incident gave him the opportunity of hurrying on to their higher life those among the Lamas who had shown too much radicalism in their proposed method of solving his problem. He never ceases to ponder upon the cause of the Church and of Mongolia, and at the same time likes to indulge himself with useless trifles. He amuses himself with artillery. A retired Russian officer presented him with 2 old guns, for which the donor received the title of Tum Ba Ir Hun, that is, Prince Dear to My Heart. On holidays, these cannon were fired to the great amusement of the blind man. Motor cars, gramophones, telephones, crystals, porcelains, pictures, perfumes, musical instruments, rare animals and birds, elephants, Himalayan bears, monkeys, Indian snakes and parrots, all these were in the palace of the god, but all were soon cast aside and forgotten. To Urga came pilgrims and presents from all the Lamaite and Buddhist world. Once the treasurer of the palace, the Honorable Balma Dorji, took me into the great hall where the presents were kept. It was a most unique museum of precious articles. Here were gathered together rare objects unknown to the museums of Europe. The treasurer, as he opened a case with a silver lock, said to me, "These are pure gold nuggets from Bai Kem. Here are black sables from Kemchik. These the miraculous deer horns. This a box sent by the Orochans and filled with precious ginseng roots and fragrant musk. This a bit of amber from the coast of the frozen sea, and it weighs 124 lans, about 10 pounds. These are precious stones from India, fragrant zebet and carved ivory from China." He showed the exhibits and talked of them for a long time and evidently enjoyed the telling. And really it was wonderful. Before my eyes lay the bundles of rare furs, white beaver, black sables, white, blue and black fox and black panthers, small beautifully carved tortoise-shell boxes containing hatticks 10 or 15 yards long, woven from Indian silk as fine as the webs of the spider, small bags made of golden thread filled with pearls, the presents of Indian Rajas, precious rings with sapphires and rubies from China and India, big pieces of jade, rough diamonds, ivory tusks ornamented with gold, pearls and precious stones, bright clothes sewn with gold and silver thread, walrus tusks carved in bas-relief by the primitive artists on the shore of the Bering Sea, and much more that one cannot recall or recount. In a separate room stood the cases with the statues of Buddha, made of gold, silver, bronze, ivory, coral, mother of pearl, and from a rare colored and fragrant species of wood. You know, when conquerors come into a country where the gods are honored, they break the images and throw them down. So it was more than 300 years ago when the Kalmucks went into Tibet, and the same was repeated in Peking when the European troops looted the place in 1900. But do you know why this is done? Take one of the statues and examine it." I picked up one nearest the edge, a wooden Buddha, and began examining it. Inside something was loose and rattled. "Do you hear it?" the Lama asked. "These are precious stones and bits of gold, the entrails of the god. This is the reason why the conquerors at once break up the statues of the gods. Many famous precious stones have appeared from the interior of the statues of the gods in India, Babylon and China." Some rooms were devoted to the library, where manuscripts and volumes of different epochs in different languages and with many diverse themes filled the shelves. Some of them are moldering or pulverizing away, and the Lamas cover these now with a solution which partially solidifies like a jelly to protect what remains from the ravages of the air. There also we saw tablets of clay with the cuneiform inscriptions, evidently from Babylonia. Chinese, Indian and Tibetan books, shelved beside those of Mongolia, tomes of the ancient pure Buddhism, books of the red caps or corrupt Buddhism, books of the yellow or Lamaite Buddhism, books of traditions, legends and parables. Groups of Lamas were perusing, studying and copying these books, preserving and spreading the ancient wisdom for their successors. One department is devoted to the mysterious books on magic, the historical lives and works of all the 31 living Buddhas, with the bulls of the Dalai Lama, of the pontiff from Tashi Lumpo, of the Hutuktu of Utai in China, of the Pandita Gagan of Dolo Nor in Inner Mongolia, and of the 100 Chinese wise men. Only the Bogdo Hutuktu and Maramba Ta Rinpoche can enter this room of mysterious lore. The keys to it rest with the seals of the living Buddha and the ruby ring of Genghis Khan ornamented with the sign of the swastika in the chest in the private study of the Bogdo. The person of His Holiness is surrounded by 5,000 lamas. They are divided into many ranks, from simple servants to the counselors of God, for which latter the government consists. Among these counselors are all the 4 Khans of Mongolia and the 5 highest princes. Of all the lamas there are 3 classes of peculiar interest, about which the living Buddha himself told me when I visited him with Djam Bolum. The god sorrowfully mourned over the demoralized and sumptuous life led by the lamas, which decreased rapidly the number of fortune-tellers and clairvoyants among their ranks, saying of it, "If the Jahansi and Narabanchi monasteries had not preserved their strict regime and rules, Thakure would have been left without prophets and fortune-tellers. Baron Abaganor, Torchiel Jurdak and the other holy lamas who had the power of seeing that which is hidden from the sight of the common people have gone with the blessing of the gods." This class of lamas is a very important one, because every important personage visiting the monasteries at Urga is shown to the Lama Tsuren, or fortune-teller, without the knowledge of the visitor, for the study of his destiny and fate, which are then communicated to the Bogdo Hutuktu, so that with these facts in his possession the Bogdo knows in what way to treat his guest, and what policy to follow towards him. The Tsurens are mostly old men, skinny, exhausted and severe ascetics. But I have met some who were young, almost boys. They were the Hubulgan, incarnate gods, the future Hutuktus and Gegans of the various Mongolian monasteries. The second class is the doctors or Ta-Lama. They observe the actions of plants and certain products from animals upon people, preserve Tibetan medicines and cures, and study anatomy very carefully but without making use of vivisection and the scalpel. They are skillful bone setters, masseurs, and great connoisseurs of hypnotism and animal magnetism. The third class is the highest rank of doctors, consisting chiefly of Tibetans and Kalmucks, poisoners. They may be said to be doctors of political medicine. They live by themselves, apart from any associates, and are the great silent weapon in the hands of the living Buddha. I was informed that a large portion of them are dumb. I saw one such doctor, the very person who poisoned the Chinese physician sent by the Chinese emperor from Peking to liquidate the living Buddha. A small white old fellow, with a deeply wrinkled face, a curl of white hairs on his chin, and with vivacious eyes that were ever shifting inquiringly about him. Whenever he comes to a monastery, the local god ceases to eat and drink in fear of the activities of this Mongolian Locusta. But even this cannot save the condemned, for a poisoned cap or shirt or boots, or a rosary, a bridle, books or religious articles soaked in a poisonous solution will surely accomplish the object of the Bogdo Khan. The deepest esteem and religious faithfulness surround the blind pontiff. Before him all fall on their faces. Khans and Hutuktus approach him on their knees. Everything about him is dark, full of oriental antiquity. The drunken blind man, listening to the banal arias of the gramophone or shaking his servants with an electric current from his dynamo, the ferocious old fellow poisoning his political enemies, the Lama keeping his people in darkness and deceiving them with his prophecies and fortune-telling. He is, however, not an entirely ordinary man. One day we sat in the room of the Bogdo, and Prince Djam Bolon translated to him my story of the Great War. The old fellow was listening very carefully, but suddenly opened his eyes widely and began to give attention to some sounds coming in from outside the room. His face became reverent, supplicant, and frightened.
"The gods call me,"
he whispered, and slowly moved into his private shrine, where he prayed loudly about 2 hours, kneeling immobile as a statue. His prayer consists of conversation with the invisible gods, to whose questions he himself gave the answers. He came out of the shrine pale and exhausted, but pleased and happy. It was his personal prayer. During the regular temple service he did not participate in the prayers, for then he is God. Sitting on his throne, he is carried and placed on the altar, and there prayed to by the lamas and the people. He only receives the prayers, hopes, tears, woe and desperation of the people, immobily gazing into space with his sharp and bright but blind eyes. At various times in the service, the lamas robe him in different vestments, combinations of yellow and red, and change his caps. The service always finishes at the solemn moment when the living Buddha, with the tiara on his head, pronounces the pontifical blessing upon the congregation, turning his face to all four cardinal points of the compass, and finally stretching out his hands toward the northwest, that is, to Europe, whither in the belief of the Yellow Faith must travel the teachings of the wise Buddha. After earnest prayers or long temple services, the pontiff seems very deeply shaken and often calls his secretaries and dictates his visions and prophecies, always very complicated and unaccompanied by his deductions. Sometimes with the words, "Their souls are communicating," he puts on his white robes and goes to pray in his shrine. Then all the gates of the palace are shut, and all the lamas are sunk in solemn, mystic fear. All are praying, telling their rosaries and whispering the orison Om Mani Padme Hung, or turning the prayer wheels with their prayers or exercisings. The fortune tellers read their horoscopes. The clairvoyants write out their visions, while Marambas search the ancient books for explanations of the words of the living Buddha. End of chapter. Chapters 41 and 42 of Beasts, Men and Gods. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Beasts, Men and Gods by Ferdinand OSSENDOWSKI. Chapter 41. The Dust of Centuries. Have you ever seen the dusty cobwebs and the mold in the cellars of some ancient castle in Italy, France, or England? This is the dust of centuries. Perhaps it touched the faces, helmets, and swords of a Roman Augustus, St. Louis, the Inquisitor, Galileo, or King Richard. Your heart is involuntarily contracted and you feel a respect for these witnesses of elapsed ages. This same impression came to me in Thakure, perhaps more deep, more realistic. Here life flows on almost as it flowed 8 centuries ago. Here man lives only in the past, and the contemporary only complicates and prevents the normal life. "Today is a great day," the living Buddha once said to me, "the day of the victory of Buddhism over all other religions. It was a long time ago. On this day, Kublai Khan called to him the lamas of all religions and ordered them to state to him how and what they believed. They praised their gods and their Hutuktus. Discussions and quarrels began. Only one lama remained silent. At last, he mockingly smiled and said, 'Great Emperor, order each to prove the power of his gods by the performance of a miracle, and afterwards judge and choose.' Kublai Khan so ordered all the lamas to show him a miracle, but all were silent, confused and powerless before him. 'Now,' said the emperor, addressing the lama who had tendered this suggestion, 'now you must prove the power of your gods.' The lama looked long and silently at the emperor, turned and gazed at the whole assembly, and then quietly stretched out his hand toward them. At this instant the golden goblet of the emperor raised itself from the table and tipped before the lips of the Khan without a visible hand supporting it. The emperor felt the delight of a fragrant wine. All were struck with astonishment and the emperor spoke. 'I elect to pray to your gods, and to them all people subject to me must pray.
What is your faith? Who are you, and from where do you come?" "My faith is the teaching of the wise Buddha. I am Pandita Lama, Turjo Gamba, from the distant and glorious monastery of Sakya in Tibet, where dwells incarnate in a human body the spirit of Buddha, his wisdom and his power. Remember, Emperor, that the peoples who hold our faith shall possess all the Western universe, and during 811 years shall spread their faith throughout the whole world." Thus it happened on this same day many centuries ago. Lama Turjogama did not return to Tibet but lived here in Takure, where there was then only a small temple. From here he traveled to the emperor at Karakoram and afterwards with him to the capital of China to fortify him in the faith, to predict the fate of state affairs and to enlighten him according to the will of God. The living Buddha was silent for a time, whispered a prayer and then continued. "Urga, the ancient nest of Buddhism, with Genghis Khan on his European conquest went out the Olets or Kalmucks. They remained there almost 400 years, living on the plains of Russia. Then they returned to Mongolia because the yellow lamas called them to light against the kings of Tibet, lamas of the red caps who were oppressing the people. The Kalmucks helped the yellow faith, but they realized that Lhasa was too distant from the whole world and could not spread our faith throughout the earth. Consequently, the Kalmuk Gushi Khan brought up from Tibet a holy lama, Undur Gagan, who had visited the king of the world. From that day, the Bogdu Gagan has continuously lived in Urga, a protector of the freedom of Mongolia and of the Chinese emperors of Mongolian origin. Undur Gagan was the first living Buddha in the lands of the Mongols. He left to us, his successors, the ring of Genghis Khan, which was sent by Kublai Khan to Dalai Lama in return for the miracle shown by the Lama Turjo Gamba. Also the top of the skull of a black mysterious miracle worker from India, using which as a bowl Strongsan, king of Tibet, drank during the temple ceremonies 1,600 years ago, as well as an ancient stone statue of Buddha brought from Delhi by the founder of the Yellow Faith, Paspa. The Bogdu clapped his hands and one of the secretaries took from a red kerchief a big silver key with which he unlocked the chest with the seals. The living Buddha slipped his hand into the chest and drew forth a small box of carved ivory, from which he took out and showed to me a large gold ring set with a magnificent ruby carved with the sign of the swastika. "This ring was always worn on the right hand of the Khans Genghis and Kublai," said the Bogdu. When the secretary had closed the chest, the Bogdu ordered him to summon his favorite Maramba, whom he directed to read some pages from an ancient book lying on the table. The Lama began to read monotonously. "When Gushi Khan, the chief of all the Olets or Kalmucks, finished the war with the Red Caps in Tibet, he carried out with him the miraculous black stone sent to the Dalai Lama by the King of the World. Gushi Khan wanted to create in Western Mongolia the capital of the Yellow Faith, but the Olets at that time were at war with the Manchu emperors for the throne of China and suffered one defeat after another. The last Khan of the Olets, Amursana, ran away into Russia, but before his escape sent to Urga the sacred black stone. While it remained in Urga so that the living Buddha could bless the people with it, disease and misfortune never touched the Mongolians and their cattle. About 100 years ago, however, someone stole the sacred stone, and since then Buddhists have vainly sought it throughout the whole world. With its disappearance the Mongol people began gradually to die." "Enough," ordered Bogdu Gagan. "Our neighbors hold us in contempt. They forget that we were their sovereigns, but we preserve our holy traditions, and we know that the day of triumph of the Mongolian tribes and the Yellow Faith will come. We have the protectors of the faith, the Buryats. They are the truest guardians of the bequests of Genghis Khan."
So spoke the living Buddha, and so have spoken the ancient books. End of chapter. Chapter 42. The Books of Miracles. Prince Djambolon asked a Maramba to show us the library of the living Buddha. It is a big room occupied by scores of writers who prepare the works dealing with the miracles of all the living Buddhas, beginning with Under Gagan and ending with those of the Gagans and Hutuktus of the different Mongol monasteries. These books are afterwards distributed through all the Lama monasteries, temples, and schools of Bandi. A Maramba read two selections. "The beatific Bogdo Gagan breathed on a mirror. Immediately as through a haze there appeared the picture of a valley in which many thousands of warriors fought one against another. The wise and favored of the gods living Buddha burned incense in a brazier and prayed to the gods to reveal the lot of the princes. In the blue smoke all saw a dark prison and the pallid, tortured bodies of the dead princes." A special book, already done into thousands of copies, dwelt upon the miracles of the present living Buddha. Prince Djambolon described to me some of the contents of this volume. "There exists an ancient wooden Buddha with open eyes. He was brought here from India and Bogdo Gagan placed him on the altar and began to pray. When he returned from the shrine, he ordered the statue of Buddha brought out. All were struck with amazement, for the eyes of the god were shut and tears were falling from them. From the wooden body green sprouts appeared, and the Bogdo said, 'Woe and joy are awaiting me. I shall become blind, but Mongolia will be free.' The prophecy is fulfilled. At another time, on a day when the living Buddha was very much excited, he ordered a basin of water brought and set before the altar. He called the lamas and began to pray. Suddenly the altar candles and the lamps lighted themselves, and the water in the basin became iridescent." Afterwards the prince described to me how the Bogdo Khan tells fortunes with fresh blood, upon whose surface appears words and pictures, with the entrails of sheep and goats, according to whose distribution the Bogdo reads the fate of the princes and knows their thoughts, with stones and bones from which the living Buddha with great accuracy reads the lot of all men, and by the stars, in accordance with whose positions the Bogdo prepares amulets against bullets and disease. "The former Bogdo Khans told fortunes only by the use of the black stone," said the Maramba. "On the surface of the stone appeared Tibetan inscriptions, which the Bogdo read and thus learned the lot of whole nations." When the Maramba spoke of the black stone with the Tibetan legends appearing on it, I at once recalled that it was possible. In southeastern Urianhai, in Ulan Taiga, I came across a place where black slate was decomposing. All the pieces of this slate were covered with a special white lichen, which formed very complicated designs, reminding me of a Venetian lace pattern or whole pages of mysterious runes. When the slate was wet, these designs disappeared, and then, as they were dried, the patterns came out again. Nobody has the right or dares to ask the living Buddha to tell his fortune. He predicts only when he feels the inspiration or when a special delegate comes to him bearing a request for it from the Dalai Lama or the Tashi Lama. When the Russian Tsar, Alexander I, fell under the influence of Baroness Gzudener and of her extreme mysticism, he dispatched a special envoy to the living Buddha to ask about his destiny. The then Bogdo Khan, quite a young man, told his fortune according to the black stone and predicted that the White Tsar would finish his life in very painful wanderings unknown to all and everywhere pursued. In Russia today, there exists a popular belief that Alexander I spent the last days of his life as a wanderer throughout Russia and Siberia under the pseudonym of Fyodor Kuzmich, helping and consoling prisoners, beggars and other suffering people, often pursued and imprisoned by the police, and finally dying at Tomsk in Siberia, where even until now they have preserved the house where he spent his last days and have kept his grave sacred, a place of pilgrimages and miracles. The former dynasty of Romanov was deeply interested in the biography of Fyodor Kuzmich, and this interest fixed the opinion that Kuzmich was really the Tsar Alexander I, who had voluntarily taken upon himself this severe penance. End of chapter. Chapters 43, 44, and 45 of Beasts, Men, and Gods. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Beasts, Men, and Gods by Ferdinand OSSENDOWSKI. Chapter 43. The Birth of the Living Buddha. The living Buddha does not die. His soul sometimes passes into that of a child born on the day of his death, and sometimes transfers itself to another being during the life of the Buddha. This new mortal dwelling of the sacred spirit of the Buddha almost always appears in the yurta of some poor Tibetan or Mongol family. There is a reason of policy for this. If the Buddha appears in the family of a rich prince, it could result in the elevation of a family that would not yield obedience to the clergy, and such has happened in the past. While on the other hand, any poor, unknown family that becomes the heritor of the throne of Genghis Khan acquires riches and is readily submissive to the lamas. Only 3 or 4 living Buddhas were of purely Mongolian origin, the remaining were Tibetans. One of the counselors of the living Buddha, Lama Khan Chasaktu, told me the following. In the monasteries at Lhasa and Tashi Lompo, they are kept constantly informed through letters from Urga about the health of the living Buddha. When his human body becomes old and the spirit of Buddha strives to extricate itself, special solemn services begin in the Tibetan temples, together with the telling of fortunes by astrology. These rites indicate the specially pious lamas who must discover where the spirit of the Buddha will be reincarnated. For this purpose they travel throughout the whole land and observe. Often God himself gives them signs and indications. Sometimes the white wolf appears near the yurta of a poor shepherd, or a lamb with 2 heads is born, or a meteor falls from the sky. Some lamas take fish from the sacred lake Tangri Nor and read on the scales thereof the name of the new Bogdukan. Others pick out stones whose cracks indicate to them where they must search and whom they must find, while others secrete themselves in narrow mountain ravines to listen to the voices of the spirits of the mountains, pronouncing the name of the new choice of the gods. When he is found, all the possible information about his family is secretly collected and presented to the most learned Tashi Lama, having the name of Erdeni, the great gem of learning, who, according to the runes of Rama, verifies the selection. If he is in agreement with it, he sends a secret letter to the Dalai Lama, who holds a special sacrifice in the temple of the Spirit of the Mountains and confirms the election by putting his great seal on this letter of the Tashi Lama. If the old living Buddha be still alive, the name of his successor is kept a deep secret. If the spirit of Buddha has already gone out from the body of Bogdukan, a special legation appears from Tibet with the new living Buddha. The same process accompanies the election of the Gagan and Hutuktus in all the Lamaite monasteries in Mongolia, but confirmation of the election resides with the living Buddha and is only announced to Lhasa after the event. End of chapter. Chapter 44. A page in the history of the present living Buddha. The present Bogdukan of Outer Mongolian is a Tibetan. He sprang from a poor family living in the neighborhood of Sakya Kure in western Tibet. From earliest youth he had a stormy, quite unaesthetic nature. He was fired with the idea of the independence and glorification of Mongolia and the successors of Genghis Khan. This gave him at once a great influence among the lamas, princes and khans of Mongolia, and also with the Russian government, which always tried to attract him to their side. He did not fear to arraign himself against the Manchu dynasty in China, and always had the help of Russia, Tibet, the Buryats and Kirghiz, furnishing him with money, weapons, warriors and diplomatic aid. The Chinese emperors avoided open war with the living God, because it might arouse the protests of the Chinese Buddhists. At one time they sent to the Bogdo Khan a skillful doctor-poisoner. The living Buddha, however, at once understood the meaning of this medical attention and, knowing the power of Asiatic poisons, decided to make a journey through the Mongol monasteries and through Tibet. As his substitute, he left a Hubilgan who made friends with the Chinese doctor and inquired from him the purposes and details of his arrival. Very soon the Chinese died from some unknown cause, and the living Buddha returned to his comfortable capital. On another occasion danger threatened the living God. It was when Lhasa decided that the Bogdo Khan was carrying out a policy too independent of Tibet. The Dalai Lama began negotiations with several khans and princes, with the Sain Noyan Khan and Jasaktu Khan leading the movement, and persuaded them to accelerate the immigration of the spirit of Buddha into another human form. They came to Urga, where the Bogdo Khan met them with honors and rejoicings. A great feast was made for them, and the conspirators already felt themselves the accomplishers of the orders of the Dalai Lama. However, at the end of the feast, they had different feelings and died with them during the night. The living Buddha ordered their bodies sent with full honors to their families. The Bogdo Khan knows every thought, every movement of the princes and khans, the slightest conspiracy against himself, and the offender is usually kindly invited to Urga, from where he does not return alive. The Chinese government decided to terminate the line of the living Buddhas. Ceasing to fight with the pontiff of Urga, the government contrived the following scheme for accomplishing its ends. Peking invited the Pandita Gagan from Dolonor and the head of the Chinese Lamaites, the Hutuktu of Utai, both of whom do not recognize the supremacy of the living Buddha, to come to the capital. They decided, after consulting the old Buddhistic books, that the present Bogdo Khan was to be the last living Buddha, because that part of the spirit of Buddha which dwells in the Bogdo Khans can abide only 31 times in the human body. Bogdo Khan is the 31st incarnated Buddha from the time of Undur Gagan, and with him, therefore, the dynasty of the Urga pontiffs must cease. However, on hearing this, the Bogdo Khan himself did some research work and found in the old Tibetan manuscripts that one of the Tibetan pontiffs was married and his son was a natural incarnated Buddha. So the Bogdo Khan married and now has a son, a very capable and energetic young man, and thus the religious throne of Genghis Khan will not be left empty. The dynasty of the Chinese emperors disappeared from the stage of political events, but the living Buddha continues to be a center for the Pan-Asiatic idea. The new Chinese government in 1920 held the living Buddha under arrest in his palace, but at the beginning of 1921, Baron Ungern crossed the sacred Bogdo Ol and approached the palace from the rear. Tibetan riders shot the Chinese sentries with bow and arrow, and afterwards the Mongols penetrated into the palace and stole their god, who immediately stirred up all Mongolia and awakened the hopes of the Asiatic peoples and tribes. In the great palace of the Bogdo, a Lama showed me a special casket covered with a precious carpet, wherein they keep the bulls of the Dalai and Tashi Lamas, the decrees of the Russian and Chinese emperors, and the treaties between Mongolia, Russia, China and Tibet. In this same casket is the copper plate bearing the mysterious sign of the King of the World and the chronicle of the last vision of the living Buddha. End of chapter. Chapter 45. The Vision of the Living Buddha of May 17th, 1921. I prayed and saw that which is hidden from the eyes of the people. A vast plain was spread before me, surrounded by distant mountains.
An old Lama carried a basket filled with heavy stones. He hardly moved. From the north, a rider appeared in white robes and mounted on a white horse. He approached the Lama and said to him, "Give me your basket. I shall help you to carry them to the cure." The Lama handed his heavy burden up to him, but the rider could not raise it to his saddle, so that the old Lama had to place it back on his shoulder and continue on his way, bent under its heavy weight. Then from the north came another rider in black robes and on a black horse, who also approached the Lama and said, "Stupid! Why do you carry these stones when they are everywhere about the ground?" With these words he pushed the Lama over with the breast of his horse and scattered the stones about the ground. When the stones touched the earth, they became diamonds. All three rushed to raise them, but not one of them could break them loose from the ground. Then the old Lama exclaimed, "O gods! All my life I have carried this heavy burden, and now, when there was left so little to go, I have lost it. Help me, great good gods." Suddenly, a tottering old man appeared. He collected all the diamonds into the basket without trouble, cleaned the dust from them, raised the burden to his shoulder and started out, speaking with the Lama. "Rest a while. I have just carried my burden to the goal and I am glad to help you with yours." They went on and were soon out of sight, while the riders began to fight. They fought one whole day and then the whole night, and when the sun rose over the plain, neither was there, either alive or dead, and no trace of either remained. This I saw, Bogdu Hutuktu Khan, speaking with the great and wise Buddha, surrounded by the good and bad demons. Wise Lamas, Hutuktus, Kampos, Marambos and holy Gagans, give the answer to my vision. This was written in my presence on May 17th, 1921, from the words of the living Buddha just as he came out of his private shrine to his study. I do not know what the Hutuktu and Gagans, the fortune-tellers, sorcerers and clairvoyants replied to him, but does not the answer seem clear if one realizes the present situation in Asia? Awakened Asia is full of enigmas, but it is also full of answers to the questions set by the destiny of mankind. This great continent of mysterious pontiffs, living gods, mahatmas, and readers of the terrible book of karma is awakening, and the ocean of hundreds of millions of human lives is lashed with monstrous waves. End of chapter. Chapters 46 and 47 of Beasts, Men, and Gods. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Beasts, Men, and Gods by Ferdinand OSSENDOWSKI. Part 5. Mystery of Mysteries, the King of the World. Chapter 46. The Subterranean Kingdom. "Stop!" whispered my old Mongol guide, as we were one day crossing the plain near Tsagan Luk. "Stop!" He slipped from his camel, which lay down without his bidding. The Mongol raised his hands in prayer before his face and began to repeat the sacred phrase, Om Mani Padme Hung. The other Mongols immediately stopped their camels and began to pray. What has happened? I thought as I gazed round over the tender green grass, up to the cloudless sky and out toward the dreamy soft rays of the evening sun. The Mongols prayed for some time, whispered among themselves and, after tightening up the packs on the camels, moved on. "Did you see," asked the Mongol, "how our camels moved their ears in fear? How the herd of horses on the plain stood fixed in attention, and how the herds of sheep and cattle lay crouched close to the ground? Did you notice that the birds did not fly, the marmots did not run, and the dogs did not bark? The air trembled softly, and bore from afar the music of a song which penetrated to the hearts of men, animals and birds alike. Earth and sky ceased breathing. The wind did not blow and the sun did not move. At such a moment the wolf that is stealing up on the sheep arrests his stealthy crawl. The frightened herd of antelope suddenly checks its wild course. The knife of the shepherd cutting the sheep's throat falls from his hand. The rapacious ermine ceases to stalk the unsuspecting salga. All living beings in fear are involuntarily thrown into prayer and waiting for their fate. So it was just now. Thus it has always been whenever the king of the world in his subterranean palace prays and searches out the destiny of all the peoples on the earth.
In this wise the old Mongol, a simple, coarse shepherd and hunter, spoke to me. Mongolia, with her nude and terrible mountains, her limitless plains, covered with the widely strewn bones of the forefathers, gave birth to mystery. Her people, frightened by the stormy passions of nature or lulled by her death-like peace, feel her mystery. Her red and yellow lamas preserve and poetize her mystery. The pontiffs of Lhasa and Urga know and possess her mystery. On my journey into Central Asia I came to know for the first time about the mystery of mysteries, which I can call by no other name. At the outset I did not pay much attention to it and did not attach to it such importance as I afterwards realized belonged to it when I had analyzed and connoted many sporadic, hazy and often controversial bits of evidence. The old people on the shore of the river Amyl related to me an ancient legend to the effect that a certain Mongolian tribe in their escape from the demands of Genghis Khan hid themselves in a subterranean country. Afterwards a Soyot from near the lake of Nogan Kul showed me the smoking gate that serves as the entrance to the kingdom of Agarty. Through this gate a hunter formerly entered into the kingdom and, after his return, began to relate what he had seen there. The lamas cut out his tongue in order to prevent him from telling about the mystery of mysteries. When he arrived at old age, he came back to the entrance of this cave and disappeared into the subterranean kingdom, the memory of which had ornamented and lightened his nomad heart. I received more realistic information about this from Hutuktu de Jaramsrap in Narabanchi Kure. He told me the story of the semi-realistic arrival of the powerful king of the world from the subterranean kingdom, of his appearance, of his miracles and of his prophecies. And only then did I begin to understand that in that legend, hypnosis or mass vision, whichever it may be, is hidden not only mystery but a realistic and powerful force capable of influencing the course of the political life of Asia. From that moment I began making some investigations. The favorite Gelong Lama of Prince Chultun Beyli and the prince himself gave me an account of the subterranean kingdom. "Everything in the world," said the Gelong, "is constantly in a state of change and transition. Peoples, science, religions, laws and customs. How many great empires and brilliant cultures have perished! And that alone which remains unchanged is evil, the tool of bad spirits. More than 60,000 years ago, a holy man disappeared with a whole tribe of people under the ground and never appeared again on the surface of the earth. Many people, however, have since visited this kingdom, Sakyamuni, Undorgegan, Paspa, Kanbebar and others. No one knows where this place is. One says Afghanistan, others India. All the people there are protected against evil and crimes do not exist within its bournes. Science has there developed calmly and nothing is threatened with destruction. The subterranean people have reached the highest knowledge. Now it is a large kingdom, millions of men with the king of the world as their ruler. He knows all the forces of the world and reads all the souls of humankind in the great book of their destiny. Invisibly he rules 800 million men on the surface of the earth, and they will accomplish his every order." Prince Chultun Beyli added, This kingdom is Agarthy. It extends throughout all the subterranean passages of the whole world. I heard a learned Lama of China relating to Bogdo Khan that all the subterranean caves of America are inhabited by the ancient people who have disappeared underground. Traces of them are still found on the surface of the land. These subterranean peoples and spaces are governed by rulers owing allegiance to the King of the world. In it there is not much of the wonderful. You know that in the two greatest oceans of the East and the West there were formerly two continents. They disappeared under the water, but their people went into the subterranean kingdom. In underground caves there exists a peculiar light which affords growth to the grains and vegetables and long life without disease to the people. There are many different peoples and many different tribes. An old Buddhist Brahmin in Nepal was carrying out the will of the gods and making a visit to the ancient kingdom of Genghis, Siam, where he met a fisherman who ordered him to take a place in his boat and sail with him upon the sea. On the third day they reached an island where he met a people having two tongues, which could speak separately in different languages. They showed to him peculiar, unfamiliar animals, tortoises with 16 feet and one eye, huge snakes with a very tasty flesh, and birds with teeth which caught fish for their masters in the sea. These people told him that they had come up out of the subterranean kingdom and described to him certain parts of the underground country. The Lama Turgut, traveling with me from Urga to Peking, gave me further details. The capital of Agarthy is surrounded with towns of high priests and scientists. It reminds one of Lhasa, where the palace of the Dalai Lama, the Potala, is the top of a mountain covered with monasteries and temples. The throne of the King of the world is surrounded by millions of incarnated gods. They are the holy Panditas. The palace itself is encircled by the palaces of the Goro, who possess all the visible and invisible forces of the earth, of inferno and of the sky, and who can do everything for the life and death of man. If our mad humankind should begin a war against them, they would be able to explode the whole surface of our planet and transform it into deserts. They can dry up the seas, transform lands into oceans, and scatter the mountains into the sands of the deserts. By his order, trees, grasses and bushes can be made to grow. Old and feeble men can become young and stalwart, and the dead can be resurrected. In cars strange and unknown to us they rush through the narrow cleavages inside our planet. Some Indian Brahmins and Tibetan Dalai Lamas, during their laborious struggles to the peaks of mountains which no other human feet had trod, have found there inscriptions carved on the rocks, footprints in the snow and the tracks of wheels. The blissful Sakya Muni found on one mountain top tablets of stone carrying words which he only understood in his old age and afterwards penetrated into the kingdom of Agarthy, from which he brought back crumbs of the sacred learning preserved in his memory. There, in palaces of wonderful crystal, live the invisible rulers of all pious people, the King of the world or Brahitma, who can speak with God as I speak with you, and his two assistants, Mahitma, knowing the purposes of future events, and Mahinga, ruling the causes of these events. The holy Panditas study the world and all its forces. Sometimes the most learned among them collect together and send envoys to that place where the human eyes have never penetrated. This is described by the Tashi Lama living 850 years ago. The highest Panditas place their hands on their eyes and at the base of the brain of younger ones and force them into a deep sleep, wash their bodies with an infusion of grass, and make them immune to pain and harder than stones, wrap them in magic cloths, bind them and then pray to the great God. The petrified youths lie with eyes and ears open and alert, seeing, hearing, and remembering everything. Afterwards a Goro approaches and fastens a long, steady gaze upon them. Very slowly the bodies lift themselves from the earth and disappear. The Goro sits and stares with fixed eyes to the place whither he has sent them. Invisible threads join them to his will. Some of them course among the stars, observe their events, their unknown peoples, their life and their laws. They listen to their talk, read their books, understand their fortunes and woes, their holiness and sins, their piety and evil. Some are mingled with flame and see the creatures of fire, quick and ferocious, eternally fighting, melting and hammering metals in the depths of planets, boiling the water for geysers and springs, melting the rocks and pushing out molten streams over the surface of the earth through the holes in the mountains. Others rush together with the ever-elusive, infinitesimally small, transparent creatures of the air, and penetrate into the mysteries of their existence and into the purposes of their life. Others slip into the depths of the seas and observe the kingdom of the wise creatures of the water, who transport and spread genial warmth all over the earth, ruling the winds, waves and storms. In Erdenitsu formerly lived Pandita Hutuktu, who had come from Agarti. As he was dying, he told about the time when he lived according to the will of the Goro on a red star in the east, floated in the ice-covered ocean, and flew among the stormy fires in the depths of the earth. These are the tales which I heard in the Mongolian yurtas of princes and in the Lamaite monasteries. These stories were all related in a solemn tone which forbade challenge and doubt. Mystery. End of chapter. Chapter 47. The King of the World Before the Face of God. During my stay in Urga, I tried to find an explanation of this legend about the King of the World. Of course, the living Buddha could tell me most of all, and so I endeavored to get the story from him. In a conversation with him, I mentioned the name of the King of the World. The old pontiff sharply turned his head toward me and fixed upon me his immobile blind eyes. Unwillingly, I became silent. Our silence was a long one, and after it the pontiff continued the conversation in such a way that I understood he did not wish to accept the suggestion of my reference. On the faces of the others present I noticed expressions of astonishment and fear produced by my words, and especially was this true of the custodian of the library of the Bogdo Khan. One can readily understand that all this only made me the more anxious to press the pursuit. As I was leaving the study of the Bogdo Hutuktu, I met the librarian who had stepped out ahead of me and asked him if he would show me the library of the living Buddha, and used a very simple, sly trick with him. "Do you know, my dear Lama," I said, "once I rode in the plain at the hour when the King of the World spoke with God, and I felt the impressive majesty of this moment." To my astonishment, the old Lama very quietly answered me, "It is not right that the Buddhist and of our yellow faith should conceal it. The acknowledgement of the existence of the most holy and most powerful man, of the blissful kingdom, of the great temple of sacred science, is such a consolation to our sinful hearts and our corrupt lives that to conceal it from humankind is a sin. Well, listen," he continued. "Throughout the whole year the King of the World guides the work of the Panditas and Goros of Agarti. Only at times he goes to the temple cave where the embalmed body of his predecessor lies in a black stone coffin. This cave is always dark, but when the King of the World enters it, the walls are striped with fire, and from the lid of the coffin appear tongues of flame. The eldest Goro stands before him with covered head and face and with hands folded across his chest. This Goro never removes the covering from his face, for his head is a nude skull with living eyes and a tongue that speaks.
He is in communion with the souls of all who have gone before. The King of the world prays for a long time and afterwards approaches the coffin and stretches out his hand. The flames thereon burn brighter. The stripes of fire on the walls disappear and revive, interlace, and form mysterious signs from the alphabet Vatanan. From the coffin transparent bands of scarcely noticeable light begin to flow forth. These are the thoughts of his predecessor. Soon the King of the world stands surrounded by an aureole of this light, and fiery letters write and write upon the walls the wishes and orders of God. At this moment, the King of the world is in contact with the thoughts of all the men who influence the lot and life of all humankind, with kings, czars, khans, warlike leaders, high priests, scientists and other strong men. He realizes all their thoughts and plans. If these be pleasing before God, the King of the world will invisibly help them. If they are unpleasant in the sight of God, the King will bring them to destruction. This power is given to Agarthi by the mysterious science of Om, with which we begin all our prayers. Om is the name of an ancient holy man, the first Goro, who lived 330,000 years ago. He was the first man to know God, and who taught humankind to believe, hope and struggle with evil. Then God gave him power over all forces ruling the visible world. After his conversation with his predecessor, the King of the world assembles the great council of God, judges the actions and thoughts of great men, helps them or destroys them. Mahitma and Mahinga find the place for these actions and thoughts in the causes ruling the world. Afterwards the King of the world enters the great temple and prays in solitude. Fire appears on the altar, gradually spreading to all the altars near, and through the burning flame gradually appears the face of God. The King of the world reverently announces to God the decisions and awards of the council of God, and receives in turn the divine orders of the Almighty. As he comes forth from the temple, the King of the world radiates with divine light. End of chapter. Chapter 48 and 49 of Beasts, Men and Gods. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Beasts, Men and Gods by Ferdinand OSSENDOWSKI. Chapter 48. Reality or Religious Fantasy? Has anybody seen the King of the World? I asked. Oh yes, answered the Lama. During the solemn holidays of the ancient Buddhism in Siam and India, the King of the World appeared 5 times. He rode in a splendid car drawn by white elephants and ornamented with gold, precious stones and finest fabrics. He was robed in a white mantle and red tiara, with strings of diamonds masking his face. He blessed the people with a golden apple with the figure of a lamb above it. The blind received their sight, the dumb spoke, the deaf heard, the crippled freely moved and the dead arose, wherever the eyes of the King of the World rested. He also appeared 540 years ago in Erdenitsu. He was in the ancient Sakai Monastery and in the Narabanchi Kure. One of our living Buddhas and one of the Tashi Lamas received a message from him, written with unknown signs on golden tablets. No one could read these signs. The Tashi Lama entered the temple, placed the golden tablet on his head and began to pray. With this, the thoughts of the King of the World penetrated his brain, and, without having read the enigmatical signs, he understood and accomplished the message of the king. How many persons have ever been to Agarthi? I questioned him. Very many, answered the Lama. But all these people have kept secret that which they saw there. When the Olets destroyed Lhasa, one of their detachments in the southwestern mountains penetrated to the outskirts of Agarthy. Here they learned some of the lesser mysterious sciences and brought them to the surface of our earth. This is why the Olets and Kalmucks are artful sorcerers and prophets. Also from the eastern country, some tribes of black people penetrated to Agarthy and lived there many centuries. Afterwards, they were thrust out from the kingdom and returned to the earth, bringing with them the mystery of predictions according to cards, grasses, and the lines of the palm. They are the gypsies. Somewhere in the north of Asia, a tribe exists which is now dying and which came from the cave of Agarthy, skilled in calling back the spirits of the dead as they float through the air. The Lama was silent and afterwards, as though answering my thoughts, continued. In Agarthy, the learned Panditas write on tablets of stone all the science of our planet and of the other worlds. The Chinese learned Buddhists know this. Their science is the highest and purest. Every century 100 sages of China collect in a secret place on the shores of the sea, where from its depths come out 100 eternally living tortoises. On their shells the Chinese write all the developments of the divine science of the century. As I write, I am involuntarily reminded of a tale of an old Chinese bonze in the Temple of Heaven at Peking. He told me that tortoises live more than 3,000 years without food and air, and that this is the reason why all the columns of the Blue Temple of Heaven were set on live tortoises to preserve the wood from decay. Several times the pontiffs of Lhasa and Urga have sent envoys to the King of the World, said the Lama librarian, but they could not find him. Only a certain Tibetan leader, after a battle with the Olets, found the cave with the inscription, "This is the gate to Agarthy." From the cave a fine-appearing man came forth, presented him with a gold tablet bearing the mysterious signs and said, "The King of the World will appear before all people when the time shall have arrived for him to lead all the good people of the world against all the bad. But this time has not yet come. The most evil among mankind have not yet been born." Chiang Chun Baron Ungern sent the young prince Punsig to seek out the King of the World, but he returned with a letter from the Dalai Lama from Lhasa. When the Baron sent him a second time, he did not come back. End of chapter. Chapter 49, the final chapter. The Prophecy of the King of the World in 1890. The Hutuktu of Narabanchi related the following to me when I visited him in his monastery in the beginning of 1921. When the King of the World appeared before the Lamas, favored of God, in this monastery 30 years ago, he made a prophecy for the coming half-century. It was as follows: more and more the people will forget their souls and care about their bodies. The greatest sin and corruption will reign on the earth. People will become as ferocious animals, thirsting for the blood and death of their brothers. The crescent will grow dim, and its followers will descend into beggary and ceaseless war. Its conquerors will be stricken by the sun but will not progress upward, and twice they will be visited with the heaviest misfortune, which will end in insult before the eye of the other peoples. The crowns of kings, great and small, will fall. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There will be a terrible battle among all the peoples. The seas will become red. The earth and the bottom of the seas will be strewn with bones. Kingdoms will be scattered. Whole peoples will die. Hunger, disease, crimes unknown to the law, never before seen in the world. The enemies of God and of the divine spirit in man will come. Those who take the hand of another shall also perish. The forgotten and pursued shall rise and hold the attention of the whole world. There will be fogs and storms. Bare mountains shall suddenly be covered with forests. Earthquakes will come. Millions will change the fetters of slavery and humiliation for hunger, disease, and death. The ancient roads will be covered with crowds wandering from one place to another. The greatest and most beautiful cities shall perish in fire. 1, 2, 3. Father shall rise against son, brother against brother, and mother against daughter. Vice, crime, and the destruction of body and soul shall follow. Families shall be scattered. Truth and love shall disappear. From 10,000 men one shall remain. He shall be nude and mad and without force and the knowledge to build him a house and find his food. He will howl as the raging wolf, devour dead bodies, bite his own flesh and challenge God to fight. All the earth will be emptied. God will turn away from it, and over it there will be only night and death. Then I shall send a people, now unknown, which shall tear out the weeds of madness and vice with a strong hand, and will lead those who still remain faithful to the spirit of man in the fight against evil. They will found a new life on the earth purified by the death of nations. In the 50th year only 3 great kingdoms will appear, which will exist happily 71 years. Afterwards there will be 18 years of war and destruction. Then the peoples of Agartha will come up from their subterranean caverns to the surface of the earth. Afterwards, as I traveled farther through eastern Mongolia and to Peking, I often thought, and what if whole peoples of different colors, faiths, and tribes should begin their migration toward the west? And now, as I write these final lines, my eyes involuntarily turn to this limitless heart of Asia, over which the trails of my wanderings twine. Through whirling snow and driving clouds of sand of the Gobi, they travel back to the face of the Narabanchi Hutuktu as, with quiet voice and a slender hand pointing to the horizon, he opened to me the doors of his innermost thoughts. Near Karakorum and on the shores of Ubsanor I see the huge multicolored camps, the herds of horses and cattle, and the blue yurtas of the leaders. Above them I see the old banners of Genghis Khan, of the kings of Tibet, Siam, Afghanistan, and of Indian princes, the sacred signs of all the Lamaite pontiffs, the coats of arms of the Khans of the Olets, and the simple signs of the North Mongolian tribes. I do not hear the noise of the animated crowd. The singers do not sing the mournful songs of mountain, plain, and desert. The young riders are not delighting themselves with the races on their fleet steeds. There are innumerable crowds of old men, women, and children, and beyond in the north and west, as far as the eye can reach, the sky is red as a flame. There is the roar and crackling of fire, and the ferocious sound of battle. Who is leading these warriors who there beneath the reddened sky are shedding their own and others' blood? Who is leading these crowds of unarmed old men and women? I see severe order, deep religious understanding of purposes, patience and tenacity, a new great migration of peoples, the last march of the Mongols. Karma may have opened a new page of history. And what if the King of the world be with them? But this greatest mystery of mysteries keeps its own deep silence. End of chapter. End of book. Thank you for listening.